In the interest of full disclosure, and for those of you who do not already know, I am a member of the local Unitarian Universalist Church, and I have been a member of that church for a very long time. Our speaker today is the Reverend Molly Housch Gordon, minister of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Columbia. Reverend Gordon is a native of Tulsa, Oklahoma. She attended Hendrix College in Conway, Arkansas, where she studied religion and English. From there, she went on to earn her master's degree from the Harvard Divinity School. And she went on to become an ordained minister of the Unitarian Universalist Association. She was selected to be minister of the local Unitarian Universalist Church in 2012. Thus, she has been with the church.
Your voice is gone, Wiley.
Oh, you can't hear me?
I can't.
No, it's okay here. You're good.
It froze for a moment, but it's back.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. If you can't hear me, let me know, please. She has been with the local church and a resident of Columbia for some 10 years now. And for those of us who know her, it doesn't seem nearly so long. In addition to being a highly skilled, accomplished, and deeply engaged minister, Reverend Gordon is married to Mr. James Gordon of the MU Journalism School, and together they are the devoted parents of two absolutely lovely little girls. In addition to all else that she does, Reverend Gordon now somehow finds time to work toward her doctorate degree in divinity. One of the major reasons for the selection of Reverend Gordon to be minister of the local Unitarian Church is that she possesses a profound commitment to social change and justice, and shares and she has pressed the church to be more active and involved in social justice issues and in the social justice movement. I know of no one who has used religion and divinity in the cause of human rights and justice more effectively than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Reverend Gordon shares Dr. King's vision, and due to their common vocation, their rather similar educational background, and their common commitment to the pursuit of justice for all, as we begin to celebrate the birthday and the national holiday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I can think of no one better suited to talk about his life and his work than Reverend Gordon, who will speak to us today on the topic, Now That He Is Safely Dead, Martin Luther King Without Whitewash. It is a great pleasure for me to present to you the Reverend Molly Housch Gordon. Let me say before she speaks that we would appreciate it if you would hold your questions and comments until she has concluded her remarks, and she will let you know when she is ready to engage with you in discussion. Reverend Gordon.
Thank you, Wiley. What a humbling introduction to be mentioned in the same breath as a truly great leader. I am grateful to be with you all this afternoon. I am grateful to Wiley Miller for the invitation, and to all of you for your ongoing support of justice work here in Columbia and mid-Missouri. I will say I am going to ask Pam, I guess. Are you our Zoom administrator?
No, I'm the host, Molly.
It's
Who's the
Dave.
host? Dave? Okay.
Yeah,
Dave,
if you want to share your screen, you may. It's available to everybody.
I'm not planning to share my screen, but I'm going to do something that might be a little unorthodox, which is at 3 different points in my talk, I'd like to pause and ask people to discuss with one another for a few moments.
Oh, sure, and we can switch.
Be able to use 3 breakout rooms to do that when the time comes.
Breakout rooms. That's new to me. I'll try it.
We don't have to do breakout. We can just be a big group, and I'll just pause us. Whatever works best for our tech will be fine with me.
I'll read up on it while you're talking.
I'll give you all the heads up about that. So at 3 different points, I'm going to pause with questions for you, because I do believe, if nothing else, the time when we celebrate the life of Dr. King should be a time of communal reflection as well as action. So this afternoon, I want to spend some time remembering a more full-throated and complex Dr. King than we often hear about in the public narrative this time of the year. What does it mean to encounter the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. more fully, without the whitewash of the last 55 years of sanitizing history? What does it mean to remember him as something more radical than his most popular quotations about dreaming and love and light? In his 2015 collection, The Radical King, contemporary scholar and public intellectual Cornel West collected some of King's most prophetic and tough-minded writings. In his introduction to the collection, West reminded us of all of the ways that Dr. King was indeed more radical than we now imagine. He reminds us that the FBI recorded conversations of King consulting with Malcolm X on strategy, that he preached the redistribution of wealth and the evils of capitalism, and that on the day of his death, he phoned his church in Atlanta to give them the title of his Sunday sermon, which was "Why America May Go to Hell." West reminds us that prior to King's death in 1968, he had disapproval ratings of 72% among white Americans and 55% among Black Americans because of his opposition to the Vietnam War and his work on the Poor People's Campaign. Is this the same man celebrated today by roomfuls of corporate and political elite at plated breakfasts across the country? And what would he make of such a thing? West writes that although much of America did not know the Radical King and too few know him today, the FBI and the US government did. They called him, quote, the most dangerous man in America at the height of his political career. Yet even unto his death, West writes, King refused to silence his voice in the quest for unarmed truth and unconditional love. For King, the condition of truth was to allow suffering to speak. Cornel West continues, when most of the Black leadership of the time shunned him, King replied, what you're saying may get you a foundation grant, but it won't get you into the kingdom of truth. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a man deeply rooted in a sense of intellectual and moral clarity that is all the more stunning when we remember how unpopular it often was at the time he lived. He was a man who said things that were unpopular and perhaps are unpopular even and especially now. Quote, we have deluded ourselves into believing the myth that capitalism grew and prospered out of the Protestant ethic of hard work and sacrifice, when the fact is that capitalism was built on the exploitation and suffering of Black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both Black and white, both here and abroad, end quote. King was crystal clear as he wrote in his letter from Birmingham jail that any law that uplifts human personality is just, and any law that degrades human personality is unjust. He was clear that a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. He was clear in naming the triplet evils of our time, of racism, militarism, and the contemporary expression of capitalism. His clarity should goad us down the decades as we seek our own clarity amid the social movements of our own time. we have a whole body of radical work from Dr. King to draw from when we remove the whitewash of the last 55 years and grapple with the truth of his legacy, the truth of how dominant culture has selectively forgotten large pieces of that legacy, and began that forgetting immediately upon his death. This rather devastating poem, from which I've taken the title of my talk, was written by African-American poet and musician Carl Wendell Hines Jr. in 1965. He writes, "Now that he is safely dead, let us praise him. Build monuments to his glory, sing hosannas to his name. Dead men make such convenient heroes, for they cannot rise to challenge the images that we might fashion from their lives. It is easier to build monuments than to build a better world. So now that he is safely dead, we with eased consciences will teach our children that he was a great man, knowing that the cause for which he lived is still a cause, and the dream for which he died is still a dream, a dead man's dream." I find that poem to be a gut punch, but one that I am moved to revisit every year. Hines wrote this poem in 1965 after the assassination of Malcolm X. But after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, the poem came to also be associated with Dr. King, and over time, perhaps more closely associated with Dr. King because of his last two lines about the dream. I think of this poem every year as our nation, founded and flooded still with the logic of white supremacy, celebrates the life of Martin Luther King Jr. As I sit in churches, in neighborhoods systematically robbed of opportunity and education and resources, listening to speeches about how far we have come, how much closer to the dream. Every year, as city officials deny the lived reality of racial profiling and praise his memory in the same breath, I remember that Dr. King is not only tragically dead, but long so. He was shot and killed on that Memphis balcony 55 years ago this April, which has given the dominant culture that would maintain the status quo more than half a century to sanitize his legacy. The dominant culture has had half a century now to make of him a respectable preacher who proclaimed a vague vision of the appearance of equality that we can tell ourselves we have achieved, all while living in realities of injustice. As if his dream was simply that a few exemplary African Americans would be allowed to succeed within the stringent requirements of empire and capital, rather than a wholesale overturning of the racist, militarist, materialist triplet evils he described and decried. As if his dream was simply that well-meaning white people would think it a great insult to be named racist, rather than knowing in their bones that their destinies were tied inextricably to those still bound in centuries-old chains of systemic inequity and woven together in the same fabric of destiny. As if Dr. King's dream was assurance of colorblindness instead of liberation. The truth without whitewash is that Dr. King's dream was never easy or comfortable or safe for anyone. And it is important work every year, especially for European Americans, to complicate the sanitized legacy we encounter all around us. To remember that King was anti-capitalist and anti-militarist, as well as anti-racist, and that many of the injustices he described interlocked in his time and interlock still today in a system of inequity. It is our work year after never-ending year to be newly challenged and newly awakened by the work of Dr. King and the hundreds of thousands of other leaders of civil rights movements across history and throughout the present day. My talk will have two further sections about moral clarity and collective work towards justice in memory of Dr. King, but I'd like to pause now after this portion, remembering the radical King, and ask you, what do you remember of the radical King? I know that some of you were alive during the time of his leadership, and some of you were not yet, as I was not yet. What do you remember of the radical King, and how does he challenge you or us today? So I'm going to invite us into about 5 minutes of conversation together before I'll continue into the next section of my talk.
I remember how it was very important to me that he was against the Vietnam War, as I was. And it was really hard when he was killed. I do appreciate how he taught us about nonviolence. And I think that's very important, and I think we should continue that today. And many groups are.
I remember how he went to Memphis to support the garbage workers.
That's right.
That he was there to ask for better working conditions for them and higher wages for them, and that was I'm not sure. Obviously, the city of Memphis wasn't paying all that much and was making it difficult, and Martin Luther King went to help out there. I don't know what the attitudes of the people of Memphis were, but I assume they supported the city council.
David, I was going to bring that up too, because I remember some articles about it, reading them at the time. And looking back, seems like that's why he was shot, because he was starting to show himself that hasn't been, has subsequently been whitewashed. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up.
I had a unique experience. I heard him speak in person at a Black church in Cincinnati when I was in the 11th grade. And I have a program from that saying that he's two-faced. And the reason is because he was speaking to a Black congregation. And I wish I could have had a recording of it to see, but he was probably a lot more militant in the sense that we have to fight, we have to do this and so on. And I'm sort of embarrassed, but interested. And I don't know if we discussed it afterwards, but over the years, I have thought about that experience and my young reaction. And it helped me realize, as we've gotten involved in understanding white privilege, of how I didn't quite understand the experience of the people he was speaking to. And so that was very, very interesting. But to have, now I will say he was kind of tiny because it was a huge Black church and he was way up there, but that's one of my experiences.
I was living in, go ahead.
No, go Sue.
I was just going to say, the summer of '64, I was had a summer job in Department of the Interior, and we got the day off. And I, for a while, thought about going. But,
I have a dream speech day.
yeah, I haven't. And we got the day off, but almost everybody that worked around me and all the people that I interacted with, including her, were staying away, and I got afraid to go. And I have regretted that decision on my part.
So I was also living in Washington, D.C. area when he gave his I Have a Dream speech. I was 13 and I had planned to take the bus into the city, but my father was afraid for me to do that and would not let me do it. So it's them and not seeing the Beatles is one of the regrets of my life. But I was a college student when he was assassinated. And I was in the city, and I was a white girl in the city on an interview at the State Department, and there were fires all around me and chaos. And I didn't know what was going on because we don't just have our cell phone to look up, but I had never seen that before. But I was full of anger when I figured it out. And I wasn't afraid of the fires and the chaos, but I was just, because this was after the death also of Robert Kennedy. And so it was like, we just lost. What have we lost here? So thank you.
Mhm.
I will go back.
As a mid-Missouri native or a person who grew up in mid-Missouri, it was quite evident to me. I was a senior in high school. It was very evident that he was hated and feared. The people in Fulton, where I grew up, considered him a radical and a rabble rouser. The J. Edgar Hoover was always after him, who was a figure that I had no respect for whatsoever, but that was the establishment at the time. And when he was killed, we were in school, and the principal made all of the Black kids go to the balcony of the auditorium, separated us completely. And at the time, I naively thought, oh, they're saying prayers, or they're, doing something to recognize his sacrifice. But it turns out, when I talked to my friends later, they had been threatened within an inch of their life that if they did anything to disrupt school or demonstrate, that they would not graduate, they would be permanently expelled. And so they didn't. They gave him one day. They gave him a day off the next day. Again, only the Black kids got a day off to compose themselves so that they wouldn't cause any trouble. So I think people now have a completely different idea about how he was regarded and received at the time.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all so much for those reflections. I'd like to continue on to share that, of course, I am uplifting that King was more radical than he is now remembered to be, but I also want to name that radical does not mean puritanical or completely caught up in very polarized Black and white thinking. That King was a powerful transformation, but he was powerful force for transformation, but he was obviously not infallible or humble, that he did seek to grapple with the moment in which he led. It seems from biographical anecdotes that he was surely fully human in his experience of confusion and doubt. When the 2014 film Selma created an intimate portrait of King and others during the time leading up to the Bloody Sunday march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the thing I remember as most affecting about the film was the imaginative glimpse it gave us into moments that biographers had noted before profound strategic decisions were made. In the film, we poignantly see King arguing with colleagues and fellow movement leaders, wrestling with himself after the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson, and mired in self-doubt at the beginning of one march that he turned around after negotiations with local leaders before continuing it later on. And I want to remark that while we sanitize King by watering down the clarity and deep challenge of his stances on race, peace, and poverty, it also sanitizes his legacy to portray it simplistically and without its own share of doubt, missteps, and fear. Indeed, we often sanitize the legacy of the entire civil rights movement in today's telling of history, in both ways, telling a linear, logical, and less challenging story of our history. Rosa sat, Martin marched, they won, the end. But as those of you who were there recall, anything is more muddled than that. As with any social movement, the American Civil Rights Movement was anything but certain, linear, or respectable in the sense that some seem to demand of today's justice movements. Its demands were not considered reasonable at the time, or respectable, or safe, or often strategically timely. It was, as all movements are, sometimes messy, sometimes full of disagreements, strategic missteps, or confusion. And it was a challenging movement, asking far more of people than they were sure they were ready to give. One profound example of this from that time is the Children's Crusade in Birmingham, Alabama, when thousands of teenagers and children as young as 6 marched for voting rights, and hundreds were arrested in a demonstration that was full of uncertain risk. For parents and organizers, the uncertainty of this act was a moral uncertainty. Would involving these children put their lives in grave danger? What cost was simply too dear for liberation? And the uncertainty of this march was also a strategic one. Would the country watching have their conscience awakened by the mass arrest of Black children by white police? Or would they simply condemn those children's Black parents as irresponsible or neglectful? Would the response be sympathy or backlash? In advance of the march, none of it was clear. And yet the children marched as they chose to do. And in their courage was clarity for the country, for a moment at least. There are many other examples of clarity and uncertainty warring throughout the civil rights movement. As much as we might tell ourselves otherwise in hindsight, absolutely none of it was a clear bet. Indeed, the entire trajectory is only clear in hindsight, as is always the case. But it was in and through that uncertain clarity that thousands of freedom fighters brought transformation for us all. Transformation not final or finished, but profound indeed. And I believe we would do well to remember this fact as well when we consider the social movements of our own day and discern our own role in them. We cannot expect our contemporary movements for justice or our place in them to be linear or certain or respectable. Indeed, these movements' propensity to change us and everything around us is exactly what makes them so profoundly important and so profoundly bewildering to live through. It has become almost trite to remind folks that if they wonder whether they would have marched with King, they need only ask themselves what they are doing in this contemporary moment of Black Lives Matter advocacy, and the answer is right there. It has almost become trite, and yet I am continually chastened by the reminder. The truth is that the level of challenge in any given moment diminishes the level of clarity we feel about how and whether we participate in that moment. It has become easy to side ourselves with King in hindsight because we've made his legacy so simple, respectable, and unchallenging. But the challenge, as you all have named, for individuals living through that time was to muddle their way into enough clarity to act when it was not at all clear that he would win, that his actions were worth the risks that may or may not surround him, and that he had the right demands or the best strategy. For the vast majority of the civil rights movement, Black activists and white segregationists chose their sides, while the vast majority of the country passively chose to watch from the sidelines. For the white progressive particularly, and here I include myself, the failure to show up for liberation in our own day often has far more to do with passivity born of confusion than any kind of ill will. And we truly sit amid many questions. Is this the right strategy, the right ask, the right place for my energy, the right risk? And how much of a risk is it anyway? Is it too much to take? Can I even know ahead of time? Many times in our contemporary movement moment, I have sat wrestling with these questions only to look up and realize that the moment has already passed me by. And I am left without clear answers and without ever having acted. I have found myself admitting to myself how possible it is that I would have gladly and passionately joined Dr. King the day after he won. The truth is that we cannot and will not have clear or certain answers to these questions before we are compelled to act. Dr. King did not. Civil rights leaders across generations did not, and we will not. And yet action is essential. King reminds us to accept passively an unjust system is to cooperate with that system. And too often failing to choose a side is choosing the side of the status quo, which is the side of power, privilege, and least resistance. This is such a hard truth that I grapple with continually. We will never have certainty in the struggle for justice, but I believe we can ask ourselves a few more productive questions in any situation that could give us the clarity to act. Whose dignity is most at risk in this situation, set as it is in the context of larger systems of power and privilege? Who is most vulnerable, and what are they asking of me? Then we can go do what we are asked. And for those of us with privilege, we can ask ourselves a further question. Does this ask feel too big, too risky, too outside the bounds of what it is to be a respectable member of society? Because unless it does, we might not be as far to the side of love as we think. In the face of death-dealing powers and the principalities that we must oppose, Our fear and trembling and even our confusion might be exactly the cue that we have reached our true call to action. And so I wanted to pause now and ask, what are some of the places where you find yourself confused or challenged in today's justice movements? And what might that feeling of confusion and challenge be calling you to do? So I'll pause again for 5 minutes and hear any reflections that you'd like to share about contemporary challenge and moments of wrestling and grappling.
We definitely have to fight for voting rights. I don't understand why we have to, we make one step forward and there's 2 steps back. And why there is so much voter suppression. That's one issue among all of the many.
Well, certainly one of the questions that we're faced with today is the question of reparations. And under what conditions should reparations be given? To whom should they be given? And certainly I find that troubling. And we are dealing with the heirs who were denied particularly, and the heirs are still being denied. But what is the appropriate and helpful thing to do that is reasonable? And I find that a significant problem as to how much should be done and under what conditions should it be done.
I had an interesting thing happen at the start of Desert Storm, which put me face to face. I was at lunchtime the day Desert Storm started. I headed up to walk downtown. I worked in the Truman Building in Jeff City, and Jeff City is a very different town than Columbia, and it certainly was at that time. And there were some of the breakoff group of Unitarians in Jeff City that were protesting in front of the start of Desert Storm, in front of the post office. And I joined them for a while. And it is the only time in all my career that I felt that I might lose a merit system job from doing that. And I decided after that one lunch hour that I would not do it again in that setting. I could protest, join a march of a similar thing here in Columbia, and there was a larger group. There were 8 or 10 of us, and it was such a more conservative setting. I mean, everybody in that time all wore yellow ribbons, or their booths had yellow ribbons, and I wasn't going to do that for sure. So I didn't stand up fully, but I certainly didn't join the crowd against them.
I think that in this day, my actions in support of public schools for everyone kind of deals with this, because as I've studied more in that issue, I realized that the charter school movement and the private school movement and the voucher movement are all rooted in racism again, and trying to revert back to the time when separate schools were there and they weren't equal, and that there are factions in our society that are trying to revert to that again, which makes me very sad.
Wow.
Thank you all for these reflections about some of our own grappling with the meeting place of complexity and moral clarity, and the recognition that true equity means people with more privilege being willing to bear more of the risk that people with less privilege are forced to bear by the systems that are in place. Those are some really important reflections. And King was a person of towering moral clarity who spoke the truth in love and whose utterances should challenge and even grieve us today. But I do also want to recall today, as we prepare to spend a weekend honoring him, that he did not act or speak or organize alone. As we gather this week and next to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the temptation is strong to imagine a charismatic and gifted man single-handedly moving a generation forward to justice. And he was gifted indeed, and his contributions are profound. But it is also important to remember that King surely sat around many tables in many church meeting rooms, consulting with colleagues, dreaming with friends, and grieving with loved ones. And to remember that beyond him at 1,000 tables across the South and across the country, organizers of less renown also gathered to plot and plan and organize for justice. The story of the civil rights movement of that era was never a story about a single man. It was the story of a collective. And as we gather to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day next week and over the weekend, I hope we will recognize that we are not called to celebrate a hero's journey, but rather a legacy of good works in the context of an entire movement landscape. I hope we will recall that the narrative of the hero's journey to collective justice is a lie of white supremacy, setting us up to believe that only the great and gifted are worthy to lead, that our isolation is our success, when in fact it is only ever by community that we are saved, only through our interconnections that we can ever be free. This savior or hero narrative is as ubiquitous as it is wrong. It is common of the way we retell stories of the civil rights movements and other social movements, and it is common in current day justice work as we all search for who might rise to the top of the movement, who is this generation's king. There is a term, social entrepreneurship, that I see tossed around a lot these days, says poverty lawyer Dean Spade, that what we just need is the right person to graduate from Harvard, maybe Harvard Business School, and have this vision about how to change poverty, how to end poverty. That kind of imagination that there's just the smart, right-thinking, charismatic individual, and that's how change is made, is completely the opposite of everything we know about movements, he writes. We know that real expertise and leadership around transforming poverty is going to come from masses of poor people in coordinated movement together, solving these problems and creating a new world, end quote. Indeed, when we look back to the full story of the civil rights movement, this is exactly what we see. Masses of African-American activists and citizens, experts in their own lives and needs, organizing together, organizing white allies, sitting in, marching, boycotting, door knocking, and through a great network of long and hard effort, changing something about our world. We often picture Martin at the head of the march, but we can look back to also see hundreds of students mobilizing, dozens of women like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer organizing behind the scenes, and thousands of ordinary folks making courageous decisions to risk their bodies for the sake of their freedom. Here are some of their words. When an individual is protesting society's refusal to acknowledge his dignity as a human being, the very act of protest confers dignity on him. And this is from an advisor to Dr. King, Bayard Rustin. From Fannie Lou Hamer, sometimes it seems like to tell the truth today is to run the risk of being killed, but if I fall, I'll fall 5 feet 4 inches forward in the fight for freedom. Fannie Lou Hamer again, a rallying cry for all of our movements today: nobody's free until everybody's free. And from Ella Baker, you didn't see me on television, you didn't see news stories about me. The kind of role that I tried to play was to pick up pieces or put together pieces out of which I hoped organization might come. My theory is strong people don't need strong leaders. And from Fannie Lou Hamer again, I guess if I'd had any sense, I'd have been a little scared. But what was the point of being scared? The only thing they could do was kill me, and it kind of seemed like they'd been trying to do that a little bit at a time since I could remember. And from Ella Baker, oppressed people, whatever their level of formal education, have the ability to understand and interpret the world around them, to see the world for what it is, and to move to transform it. I've always thought that what is needed is the development of people who are interested not in being leaders as much as in developing leadership in others. In many of today's justice movements, we see a deep commitment to the approach that Ella Baker spoke of, diffuse and networked leadership that is concerned far less with one key figure and far more with the uplift of scores of leaders. Mainstream narratives sometimes describe contemporary movements as leaderless, but in truth, they are leaderful, bursting with leadership that is shared, developed, and nourished. I see the example of this kind of leadership the most in marginalized communities and today's expressions of advocacy, from the contemporary movement for Black lives, from trans activists, and the disability movement. People who know in their bones that they will ever only arrive at true justice together. If it's not for everyone, it's not justice. Dominant culture tries to teach us a different story. As a middle-class white woman, I have been taught that my success is proven by my capacity to not need anyone else. I've been taught that we're all the same, so surely I know exactly what other people need and can help them achieve it. I've been taught that the way out of systemic problems like racism and climate change is individual behavior, like being nice and refusing to use plastic straws. The truth is that my isolation, false sense of expertise, and ignorance of larger systems are exactly what hold injustice in place. And the invitation in this truth is not toward shame, but toward relationship. In the book, No More Heroes, Grassroots Challenges to Savior Mentality, speaking to author Jordan Flaherty, Paula Helm Hernandez, a queer Latina organizer and artist, reflected on lessons of multiracial movement building. I think white people in movement building need to make a call about whether they will be individual activists or whether they are really ready to commit to collective organizing. The latter means you don't get the final vote on the strategy, pace, timing, tone, and approach. Put another way, it means you have to learn how to share political imagination, power, and work without having to be in charge. For people with privileged identities, this is harder than it sounds. I read that and agree, yes, I will share power and work without having to be in charge. But the number of times I have accidentally put myself in the center of work without ever realizing I'm doing it is a lot of times. I'm used to being in the center. My body hardly knows what it feels like to not be in the center. But in his book, No More Heroes, journalist and activist Jordan Flaherty reassures us the savior mentality is not about individual failings. It is the logical result of a racist, colonialist, capitalist, heteropatriarchal system setting us against each other. We are each socialized into this system, but it's our responsibility to learn better and do better, to get ourselves around the table in community, to listen more than we speak, to become parts of collective movements rather than individual activism. Leadership scholar Margaret Wheatley writes, there is no power greater than a community discovering what it cares about. Ask what's possible. Keep asking. Assume that many others share your dreams. Talk to people you know. Talk to people you don't know. Talk to people you never talk to. Be intrigued by the differences you hear. Expect to be surprised. Treasure curiosity more than certainty. Invite in everybody who cares to work on what's possible, acknowledging that everyone is an expert about something. Know that creative solutions come from new connections. Remember, you don't fear people whose story you know. Real listening always brings people together. Trust that meaningful conversations can change your world. Rely on human goodness. Stay together. This Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, I invite you to step away from the isolation that tempts us toward individual activism without connection, and to expand your network and stay together. Certainly, this gathering is one way you have chosen to deepen into community for the good of all. I wonder what are some other ways that you feel moved into collectivist organizing over individualist action in your lives? And I'll open that up as our final question to share with one another. And I think we only have about 3 minutes before I need to turn it back over to you all to do your business.
We didn't get to talk about some of the other issues that many of us are working on. I received an email from the League of Women Voters of the United States that January 22nd, there will be a Women's March. I don't know yet whether one is being planned for Columbia. Probably there will be. So women's reproductive rights are something that is dear to my heart. I think there are many problems with capitalism to make people more equal and not have corporations have all the power in our country. There are many more.
I just wanted to say that excuse me, Pam.
I think you're going to have to put it in the chat, Kathy.
Yeah, I'm sorry you were breaking up so much. I
Yeah.
see a hand from Shemin.
Yeah, I just want to say, Molly, I really wish that they would allow you to give this speech at the diversity breakfast. Like that you could, that they would allow you to speak like this at the diversity breakfast, because yeah, our collective activism is really what I think is lacking in our community at the moment. I think that we are, as a city, at the precipice of creating what we call, we have the Opportunity Campus, which has a great name, but is really being designed by folks other than the folks who will be using the Opportunity Campus. And it feels very much to me, not to put too fine a point on it, that the progressive community is not behind allowing folks who are poor, folks who are homeless, folks who are utilizing services to actually have a seat at the table. That we get pushback when we actually try, when we go before council and speak to this, whether it be about the police board or it be about ARPA funds at the county or the city level, and certainly at our state level. But in this town where we are very proud to be progressive, we are not that progressive. And it would be wonderful if we could all just be a little more internal about like what we actually believe an ally is and what we actually believe, as opposed to performative actions that make us feel good.
Thank you for that, Shemin. That's really, really important to keep in mind in this town. Someone has direct messaged me that maybe we have a little more time than I thought. Should I let the conversation continue? Okay. I see a hand from Herb and Sue.
I think we failed to mention the most important single thing in my mind to say about Martin Luther King. In that in his day, he bridged a profound gap which existed before him through his lifetime and after, between those who thought themselves progressive and wanting to promote justice from the perspective of the middle class versus the less privileged and their conceptions of the same. In Washington, D.C., area where I grew up, this was conceived as the difference between U Street African Americans who backed the NAACP, Thurgood Marshall, and so forth, which did great work, important work, and Anacostia residents who had different problems. And Martin Luther King uniquely bridged that gap in his life, as other followers since have not, without falling into the middle class liberal trap that all good things go together.
Thank you, Herb.
I would also say, I went to a city council meeting and I went for Rockbridge, because I'm on the Friends of Rockbridge board, on an issue there. But I decided to stay for the day. And this was kind of early on when the homeless was coming up. And by the end of it, I spoke. I didn't have any solution, but I said, you're talking about the homeless. It's a very small number. You have too many children and women growing up in poverty. The homeless is mostly a male. And I said, that's the bigger issue. Don't worry just about the homeless. That's what you see, but the other is for the longevity of our society. The children and the women that are single parents or whatever are the bigger issue, and we need to not just worry about solving the homeless issue.
Tragically, homelessness is extremely and profoundly on the rise among children after COVID, and even in our community.
But they're not seen.
Interlocking problem for sure.
Yeah, but they're not seen like the others, like the ones on the street.
This is Mari. Your question about collective action is thought-provoking for me, because so much of what passes for collective action these days is just demonstrations. And having participated in demonstrations since I was 15 years old, they may have had an impact when it was relatively a novel thing. They probably had an impact with the civil rights movement. They had an impact with the Vietnam War, but that was a long time ago. And I guess I haven't seen many instances when just getting together and waving signs and marching around really has made a huge difference. So part of what I struggle with is, what type of collective action can I become involved in other than voting and supporting political candidates? It's difficult to discern sometimes.
Yeah, I certainly personally come from a community organizing background, and would love to see more organizing and engagement in organizing happening in our town, where folks are truly building power through relationship, and building power that can actually make movable demands of our leadership because of the level of collectivity that we've generated. Certainly, Missouri Faith Voices, I'll just add a plug here, brings that perspective to their faith-based organizing, and they're going to be relaunching their work in Columbia in 2023. So looking forward to engaging some real grassroots organizing this year. Any final thoughts from folks as we have enter our last 5 minutes?
I look at collective action as joining groups, like trying to work with our local Democratic Party, or even whatever your congregation or church is, and create change through those groups. I also don't believe people say we're a progressive city. We fight to be progressive. We just went from being a purple city to maybe a blue city in this last election, and that took many years, and can we keep it? So I think joining groups like Muleskinners is part of the solution. I know for me, when I saw Resurrection City and went and stayed there for 7 days in the 60s, and those big collection actions, that showed me being part of a larger group was so important. Not necessarily rallies, but being part of the group that created it. I always remind people, strangers on airplanes, we live in the country of the biggest inequality of wealth in the world. Thank you.
And it has grown worse recently. I think we have to recognize. I know we're running out of time here, and I've tried to keep myself rather quiet. But I have to say a few things at any rate. First, Molly, thank you so terribly much. This has been a highly thought-provocative presentation. And I think it gives us fodder to continue to remain involved. I think that's one of the key things. Your point about middle-class people sitting on the sidelines and and watching as the world goes by, that does not help us at all. We have to remain involved and engaged in, I think, all of the activities that are available to us throughout our community. So I hope that's something that we're taking away from your presentation. I share Maury's concern about demonstrations and protests. I still engage in some of them. I question their effectiveness, but I don't know anything better to do. So I would rather do those. For example, you will always find me standing out on days of executions in this town. I am always in front of the courthouse columns, along with about 15 other devoted souls, protesting this barbaric practice of capital punishment, which is rooted in racism also, by the way. We don't always, as you point out, Molly, with Martin Luther King himself, we don't always choose the right path. We don't always know how to be involved. We don't always know what strategy to use, but if we continue to plod along and remain engaged, I think we do have an impact at some point. And I will stop there because I know we are getting close on time.
Thank you, Wiley. That strikes me as a benediction. I see a hand from Margaret, though, if you'd like to jump in before we end.
Yes, I also want to say how very inspiring your talk has been. And all during the talk, well, it's all been about Martin Luther King and mostly our African-American problems with human rights. I couldn't help but thinking of the Palestinians who are being crushed. Their homes are being demolished, they're being killed. And as you quoted Fannie Lou Hamer, no one is free until everyone is free. And so I really appreciate the ideas about collective action and hearing all the comments of everyone else.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you for bringing in that important note about the global struggle for freedom. I would like to end my time with you with just a benediction that may we live into the legacy of Martin and Malcolm and Bayard and Rosa and Ella and Fannie and all the other unnamed souls who have moved us forward. May we continue pulling the arc of the universe toward justice. May we do it together, for only then can we move toward freedom. Thank you for your time today and for the invitation.
Thank you,
Thank
Reverend
you,
Gordon,
Molly.
for coming. That was really wonderful.
Thank you, Molly. You were inspiring.
Thank you for a very, as someone else said, thought-provoking way. I mean, I always look at Martin Luther King Jr. weekend as a time to kind of self-reflect, right? What am I doing personally to create the world that I want? And so it's never a bad time, I think, to reflect on what each of us can do to forward the values that we hold dear in our community and the larger world. Kathy wanted me to be sure to read in her comments. She says, Reverend Gordon mentioned the disparity in traffic stops here. This is going back a bit. This is one issue the Citizens Police Review Board has tried to address. Right now, City Council and staff are wrestling with reforming that board, wanting, I think, to avoid controversy. So just another plank to throw on the fire of things that are going on in our community right now that could maybe use a little bit of our attention. I put the link in the chat. There will be a recording of today's speaker up on our website later today, thanks to Dave Taylor. So you're welcome to share that with friends who maybe couldn't attend at noon today. They can watch this later.